I want to explore two mysteries about Jesus' most famous words on the subject of money. And you probably know these words or think you know these words. You cannot serve God. And in most modern translations, you'll read money. And here are the two mysteries. First, why not? Why can't you serve God and money, each in their own way? Why can't you kind of serve God, of course, but also kind of do the proper things to make money, spend money in an ethical way? And the real mystery here is that Jesus shares his world with the emperor of Rome, a man who calls himself Caesar, who claims to be Lord of the whole world. And Jesus pretty much says you can serve God and Caesar. When he's confronted with the question of whether the residents of Judea should pay tax, he has them bring him a denarius. It has the face of Caesar on it. And he says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And he seems to be saying, you can serve Caesar with the things that properly belong to him. You don't render to Caesar what belongs to God. But there is a realm that Caesar commands, and within that realm, you give him what he asks for. If it's his, you give it back. But of course, you also serve God in that realm. You don't serve Caesar as God, but you serve Caesar as you serve God. So if you can serve God and Caesar, why does Jesus say you cannot serve God and money? And this is the second mystery, actually. That word money, though translated that way in most of our modern translations, in the Greek that the New Testament writers are writing in, is actually just an Aramaic word. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic his whole life. And normally, when he speaks Aramaic, the gospel writers translate it into the Greek that their own audience would have read and understood, just like we translate their words into English. But this word, mammon, they leave untranslated. And still some English translations then leave it untranslated. Why? What did Jesus really say? You cannot serve God and. So to get at this, I want us to think about the way that money uniquely functions in our world and in our lives. And we can go back to this basic definition that you learned if you took economics, that money, according to economists, is a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. And when you put it that way, it sounds very useful, probably neutral, if not beneficial, and not obviously like something that would be the one thing you can't serve God and. But it becomes a little clearer when you start to realize that really what money is a unique form of power. Power, the ability to get something done in the world, to make something of the world, to make a difference in the world, and maybe especially the ability to get things done that you want to get done, whether or not other people want them to get done. When you have that, you have power. And money is a very powerful form of power in three ways that correspond to the three elements of its definition. Money is fungible power. Fungible, this kind of fancy word that means you can exchange it. You can exchange it for other things. In fact, most modern money has no value in and of itself. Its value is that you can turn it into pretty much anything you want. That's quite a delightful form of power. Countable power. It's a unit of account. You can know how much you have. You can actually count it up. You can look at your balance in a ledger and figure out exactly how much you have. That also is quite a unique form of power. And then it's storable, which is to say you don't have to use it now. You can save it if you can find a safe place to save it or invest it. And you can use it later at a time and a place that you choose. This is actually very unique because almost all other forms of power have to be used right away, which is to say they are not storable. You can't just sort of use your power whenever you choose. I have a certain amount of power to teach in this video, and I have to use it now. I can't decide to walk away and ask you to come back tomorrow. You're watching now. I'm recording now. I use my power now or I lose my power. But money, you can save for later and use when you like. That's a very unique form of power. Most forms of power can't be easily counted. How much power do you have? If you've ever been the parent of a small child, even a small child, you know you have some amount of power over your child, but how much do you have? Very hard to tell, let alone if you're an entrepreneur or a leader in a business or an organization, and you're trying to figure out how much can I actually get done here that I want to get done? Very hard to count, but with money, you know. And maybe most powerfully, you can exchange money. But most forms of power you can't exchange. You're only the parent of this one child. You only have this one role in an organization, and you can't easily change it to do that same kind of thing somewhere else. But with money, you can exchange it for anything you want. And all this is true even of the most powerful person in Jesus' world, Caesar himself, who in fact cannot store up his power. He has to be Caesar today. He has to be Caesar with effectiveness today. And if he's not today, he probably won't be Caesar tomorrow. He can't decide to be Caesar later. He has to be Caesar today. He can't fully assess how much power he had. Even Caesar had to take the vote of the legions, where he would kind of get the acclamation of the army to continue to rule. But how much time does Caesar spend wondering whether he really is safe and can really trust the soldiers and guards around him and that they're not going to take him out and replace him with another Caesar? And Caesar cannot decide to be Caesar somewhere else. He has to be Caesar in Rome. Money gives you a power that even Caesar does not have. Money gives you the ultimate form of power. Storable, countable, fungible. And it offers you this kind of vision of a world that, in this beautiful and disturbing phrase from our friend John Tyson, gives you the option of abundance without dependence. Abundance without dependence. You can have whatever you want, but you are not dependent on your circumstances, on other people. You know how much you have. You can use it for what you want. You can use it when you want. Abundance without dependence, power without relationship. This is the dream that money gives us access to. Control, creative control. Because in fact, Caesar, one of Caesar's problems is he can mostly only make you do things he can force you to do. But money unlocks creative capacity in other people. Other people will create something if you pay them to do it. And so money gives you not just control over the world, but creative control. Getting things I want, without needing or depending on other people, without needing God. Who needs God? If you have money, if you have enough money. Because the honest truth is that if you want something, almost anything, and have enough money, there is someone somewhere in the world who will get that thing for you. This is the first reason you cannot serve God and money, because it has a power that even the emperor doesn't have. A power that directly rivals the power of God. Now, on to the second mystery. What is it that you can't serve God and? Mammon, this word that we sometimes leave untranslated all the way into English, this Aramaic word. What is it? Well, what kinds of words do we not translate when we translate from one language to another? The principal kind of word we don't translate is a name. We leave names untranslated. We translate all the other words, but names like Jesus, which of course is a Hebrew word, meaning God saves. But we don't translate that. We just transliterate it into English. This word, mammon, the early church concluded, was left untranslated because it's not actually a thing or even just a principle, but mammon is actually intended by Jesus as a name. And I would say that it's a personal name, except that this is the name of a kind of power we call demonic, a kind of entity we call demonic. And the one thing demons hate is persons. Now, to bring up the demonic is to bring up a subject that is present in the Bible, but not commonly present in our own world. So we have to go back to the world of Jesus, the world in which Jesus lived, that did recognize the presence of demons and see kind of how they operated to get our bearings. And we see in the Gospels that the demonic seems to refer to these powers that can take possession sometimes of individuals, sometimes of whole kind of herds of kind of agents, like a herd of pigs can be possessed by a demonic power or set of powers. But the Bible also speaks of what in Ephesians are called principalities and powers, these kind of large-scale structures of human activity that somehow can become occupied by forces that oppose the will of God and the purposes of God in the world. And the early church placed mammon in this largest category, a kind of demonic power that is seeking to co-opt a human reality in order to distort and kind of dislodge the will of God in the world. The demonic is thought of, and we see it in Scripture, not as something that can really act with a whole lot of efficacy on its own. It's not able to act independent of agents in the world. Instead, I think of it as a will with a whisper, a will with a whisper. It can't get anything done on its own, but it can whisper in our ears. And Mammon is the name that the ancient world gave and that Jesus adopts for the whisper that comes with money. The whisper that comes with money that serves what the writer of the letter to the Ephesians called the prince of the power of the air, the power of the unseen, imagined temptation to imagine a world that is not what God intended. And the demonic hates two things about the world that God intended. One, the demonic hates persons, because to be a person is to be constituted by dependence, ultimately by love. And the demonic has rejected personhood, relationship, and love. And then because the demons, as originally created like the angels without bodies, simply to serve God in a very kind of secondary way to God's primary purpose of creating a material world filled with bearers of his image, the demons seem to have rejected this purpose, and they hate the material world. They hate bodies. They hate the creation itself. And so the demonic is the will with a whisper that wants to sever us from our relationships of love and sever us from our stewardship of the material world. In this way, Mammon, understood as this kind of will that attaches itself to money, is operating in the world with the exact opposite aim of God. God's aim is to fill this material world with persons, to fill it with persons, people like you and me, bearers of the image, until everything is known by image bearers who pay attention to God's world. The fruitfulness of God's world has been brought into being. Everything and everyone is loved, and God is known and loved in everything. Mammon wants to replace this personal world with not even a material world, but an immaterial world, a world in which matter means nothing, a world of pure abstraction, until there's no person left, nothing is known, and nothing is loved except the self. The end state of this has been called by some commodification, turning everything into something that can be bought and sold. And we see an incredible example of it at the climax of all of history in Revelation, when the great city Babylon, which is the summation of all human idolatry and injustice, finally falls. And the merchants of the earth, Revelation 18:11, weep and mourn. Those who have made their living from money, weep and mourn for her. Here's how John puts it in his vision. Since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo, and listen to this list, of gold, silver, jewels and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, slaves and human lives. Now, up to the end, this is a list of basically beautiful things that human beings have made. But they have been turned into commodities, and to the commodities have been added human beings. The end state of Mammon's activity in the world is the enslavement of persons, treating people like things. In the Roman world that the first Christians came into, there were two kinds of laws. There was the law of persons, the way people were to relate to one another as family members, as members of a society. But then there was the law of stuff, the law of things. And slaves were treated under the law of things. In the day of Jesus, many people are treated under the law of stuff. This was a world in which Mammon was running rampant. This is a world in which idolatry was having its way. And Jesus says, you cannot serve a demon that wants to destroy persons, destroy relationships, ultimately destroy creation itself, and serve the true God who wants to reunite persons, reconcile persons, restore relationships, and liberate creation from its bondage to decay. These are simply the two opposing forces in our world. You can't serve both. And we have to reckon, like the merchants who mourned the fall of Babylon, with the question of whether we have become entangled in this principle of rejection of love and rejection of creation by becoming entangled with this thing we call money. So we've come to believe at Praxis that we need to take the power of mammon and its potential to distort our lives very seriously. And I want to offer two kind of basic ways you can detox from mammon, and then two things you can substitute for the worship of mammon that involve really worshiping God in this world of money and the creation of good things. Maybe the most basic way to detox is generosity, giving away, sacrificial giving. Because there's really only four ways to use money. You can spend it, you can save it, you can invest it, or you can give it. When you spend it, you exchange it for something else, but you retain control of whatever you purchase, that good or that experience. When you save it, you try to keep it safe for later. When you invest it, you put it at risk, hoping for much more later. But in both saving and investing, you still legally retain control. Spending, saving, investing, all retain control of money. And what is the thing that money promises us? Control. But when you give in an appropriate way, you give up control through money. You give it away. You release it. And it's a practice. Generosity is a practice of saying, I do not actually get my power in the world through control. I don't get my power in the world through amassing ever more power. I'm giving it away so that I'm free and liberated from bondage to money. Giving has a power to liberate us from mammon in a way that nothing else we do with money does. So many of us have found it incredibly helpful to embrace this practice that the Bible calls tithing, beginning with 1/10 of our income. At Praxis, those of us who follow our rule of life, 1/10 of our gross income, we give away. As it's coming in, we give it away. So that the first 1/10 of our lives is just invested in saying, I don't own this, I don't control this, I'm not using this as my path to power in the world. I'm giving it up for the purposes of God and the needs of his world, especially the needs of the poor. Some of us, however, have found that it's actually helpful to go further. And 3 times in the last decade, my wife and I have decided that we actually ought to tithe on our assets, to take our net worth, the kind of financial calculation, how much do you have, and figure out what 10% of that is, figure out a way to liquidate enough of that we can give away 10%. And we found this kind of unbelievably liberating, unbelievably risky, unbelievably scary before you do it. But on the other side of giving away 10% of your assets, those things that you were counting on for some kind of future, that you discover you really are far more deeply dependent on God, and that it's better to be dependent on God than to be dependent on money. Another way to detox is just to be a lot more transparent with each other. Many of us in the Praxis community practice a kind of radical transparency with a circle of friends about what's been entrusted to us, the money that we can count. How much do you have? Most people have never heard another Christian say how much they have, own, and are stewards of. But my practice, in almost any setting I'm in, I'm glad to disclose, not on video, but in any other setting, my family's net worth, that is the assets we're still entrusted with, our family's income. Why should we be secret about this when it's the one thing we have to be so careful that we don't end up serving instead of God? Transparency and generosity are the liberating practices of detox from the power of mammon. And once you're detoxed, you can start living the flourishing life that I think we're meant to live with money as a tool. Oxygen apparently is about 20% of the air we breathe. You need oxygen to live. And to do business in our world, you need money to do the business. But when oxygen becomes 100% of the atmosphere, it's actually toxic to human beings. And you can't live in a world that's 100% oxygen. And if your world becomes 100% money, it's just as dangerous as trying to breathe an atmosphere that's 100% oxygen. It's toxic. So we found at Praxis that one of the most powerful things we can do to kind of start to use money in the service of flourishing is to use kind of an 80-20 rule of prioritizing persons as 80% of our attention in any transaction we do, in any deal we do, any business we build. Yes, it needs in 20% of it to be sustainable financially, but 80% of our attention, 80% of the value we seek to create should be relational rather than financial. Not that we're necessarily cutting our financial returns by some amount or by 80%. It's just that we aim to get so much more out of the money we invest that is in relational terms, that leads to love and dependence and the new possibility that comes through relationship in the world? What if all our uses of money, giving, saving, investing, spending, all of them, had an 80% effect, was intended with an 80% effect of strengthening relationships of dependence and abundance, especially between those with very little and those with a lot, and just a 20% financial effect that allows us to keep doing it joyfully and sustainably? A second path to flourishing with money is to reject its temptation to hurry. We've found that along with prioritizing persons, we have to prioritize patience, looking more for multiples on investment than internal rate of return, looking more for returns over time than for return within a small amount of time. This is the difference between speed and hurry. Mammon wants you to hurry. Mammon wants you to use people to get things. But the kingdom of God invites you to let things grow abundantly over time. And when we're serving Mammon, we run over people and run over things rather than just letting them grow, letting relationship grow with patience and prioritization of persons. And maybe this leads to one last reason you can't actually serve God and Mammon in the end, is that they operate on totally different and incompatible horizons of time. Money is temporary. God's kingdom is eternal. You can give yourself over to the kingdom of Mammon, and honestly, the damage you'll do, according to Deuteronomy, which says even those who get totally involved in sin and injustice, the damage lasts to the third or fourth generations. And this is actually true of everything we do with money. Within 3 generations, the damage you can do if you're exploitative will, by the grace of God, end within 3 generations. And in fact, the most ethical uses of money, most fortunes within 3 or 4 generations are spent and depleted, financially speaking. But in the same passage where God says, those who reject me see the damage last to the 3rd or 4th generation, he says, for those who love me and keep my commands, I visit blessing for 1,000 generations. There's a horizon of action that is actually 1,000 generations long, with dividends that are not primarily financial, but are relational and ultimately cultural. This is the way of love that can compound over time in a way that money never does. To live this way, though, this 1,000-generation way, requires totally dethroning the power of Mammon from our lives and reconfiguring our lives completely around love. Can we do that? It's as easy, Jesus said, as a camel going through the eye of a needle. With human beings, impossible. But with God, all things are possible.